If you were to go into a search engine and type in Scotland's worst serial killer, Peter Manuel is probably the first name you'll find. He's also considered to be Scotland's first ever serial killer, and he killed a confirmed total of 7 people in the 1950s. It's thought to be a lot higher. We know of at least 2 more. Some people think it's as many as 19. Referring to himself as the Beast of Birkenshaw and Scotland's Frankenstein, in this special episode we're looking at Peter Thomas Anthony Manuel. Stay tuned to be taken on a journey that is truly shocking to the core.
You are now listening to British Murders, the True Crime Podcast.
Hello everyone and welcome to British Murders, the podcast that focuses exclusively on British murder cases and serial killers. I'm your host Stuart Blues and this is the Season 6 special. This case was suggested via email by listener Victoria Craig and via messenger by Kath McCartney. We're in the Scottish village of Birkenshaw this week, which is located in North Lanarkshire. Let me quickly advise you that this podcast contains elements that may be alarming to some listeners. As always, listener discretion is advised. Our villain this week committed all of his crimes in Britain, but he wasn't born here. Peter Thomas Anthony Manuel was brought into the world by his mother, Bridget, on either March 13th or 15th, 1927. As with many old cases, there are so many discrepancies with the details, so please bear that in mind as I tell the story. I'm telling it to the best of my ability based on the sources used. I'm blaming the sources. Peter Manuel's birthplace was Misericordia Hospital, a 3-block medical centre located in the New York City borough of the Bronx. You heard that right, this so-called British murderer was born in America. The reason he was born across the Atlantic is that his parents moved there in 1925 to seek out a better life for themselves. They even left their firstborn child James, who was born in 1923, with relatives back in Scotland when they made the move to America. The plan was to work their way into a position of being able to afford to fly James over to live with them. He was looked after by relatives in the meantime. Samuel Manuel, the unfortunately named father of James and Peter, was originally from Lanarkshire and he was a welder by trade. In 1920s America, as the country headed towards the Great Depression, work was hard to come by. Samuel and Bridget settled in Detroit originally. The patriarch of the Manuel family worked in the state's booming auto industry as a car body maker. Peter was 2.5 years old when the infamous Wall Street stock market crash happened in 1929. Understandably, that was a tough period for everyone, not just in America, but worldwide. The Great Depression lasted 10 years between 1929 and 1939, and Samuel figured if the family were going to struggle, they might as well struggle back home in bonny Scotland. So that's what they did. The Manuel family moved back to Scotland in 1932. Peter was 4 or 5, depending on the month they moved. One source indicated that Samuel had fallen ill to some significant degree, so again, he figured if I'm going to be ill, I'm going to be ill back home in Scotland and not America. I understand that the family settled in Birkenshaw initially, hence the future nickname of the Beast of Birkenshaw, which along with Scotland's Frankenstein is what Peter would refer to himself as. Despite his parents being from Scotland, Peter he must have felt that his true home was America. Living anywhere from birth until the age of 4 or 5, and then suddenly moving over 3,000 miles across a huge body of water to settle in another country, it must have been difficult. Another shock for Peter was that he finally got to meet his brother James. 2 years later, in 1934, Samuel and Bridget brought a third child into their lives. This time it was a girl whom they named Teresa. As you'd expect, Peter had an American accent at that point. As a result, the Scottish kids at school teased him about it persistently. To make matters worse, Peter was said to have struggled with the accents of the local children. But seeing as though his parents were Scottish, maybe that was a fabrication by Peter. You'll come to learn that pathological lying was not only something Peter frequently did, but it's something that he saw as a game. From the start, Peter showed signs that he was not your run-of-the-mill, law-abiding kid. He often broke the rules, with one of his favoured pastimes being to draw sexually explicit images during lessons. It makes me think of Seth constantly drawing dicks in Superbad.
I just sit there for hours on end drawing dicks.
An arrogant young man, Peter was desperate to stand out from his classmates. If that meant getting attention due to negative behaviour, so be it. They say that kids who lack positive attention often act out to get negative attention because any attention is good attention to a kid. A young Fight Club member in the making, Peter continually provoked his classmates to try and get them to fight him. Perhaps living in America during the time of Prohibition-era gangsters such as Al Capone, Dutch Schultz and Machine Gun Kelly, not the so-called rapper, rubbed off on young Peter. By 1937, the then 10-year-old Peter was already well known to local law enforcement as a petty thief, a vocation he would continue throughout his teenage and adult years. He reportedly had a probation officer even back then, and he said that his juvenile record was the worst he'd ever seen. The infamy Peter desperately desired was slowly becoming a reality, even at the tender age of 10. The family moved around a lot, not just within Scotland, but south of the border in England too. The work search was a continuous struggle for Samuel, which eventually saw the family move to the West Midlands city of Coventry when Peter was around 12ish. The language barrier claims intensified, as Peter now had to adapt to the strong West Midlands accent after having previously claimed to have struggled with broad Scottish. Whilst in Coventry, Peter was sent to several approved schools due to his lack of discipline, but each school struggled to keep him contained. He constantly escaped, with one source claiming he did so 11 times. Being as slippery as an eel is another trait Peter had that we'll look at regularly throughout this story. The bizarre thing about Peter's lack of discipline at school was that he was actually incredibly intelligent. Typically, you may expect someone who causes massive disruption in school to struggle academically, but that wasn't the case with Peter. Whilst in and out of approved schools, Peter would continue to further his education by completing the schoolwork he had missed during his lessons. It's believed he thought he wasn't fussed about school because he thought himself significantly smarter than he was. He was arrogant to a fault, to the point that he would go on to represent himself at most, if not all, of his trials as an adult, despite no formal training as a solicitor. In 1942, in the middle of World War II, 15-year-old Peter Manuel took his breaking and entering hobby to another level. A sole female occupant had her home broken into by Peter. Rather than leaving the woman to sleep and stealing a few items from her home, Peter decided to wake the woman up and attack her. He brutally whacked her head with a hammer, his weapon of choice at the time. It's unclear what the result of that attack was. It seems as though Peter may have been convicted of the assault but wasn't sent to jail. It was common for Peter to talk his way out of being sent to prison for the crimes he committed, and the story does get a little hazy around this point, I must admit. Regardless, his burglarizing continued, as did his sexual assaults on women. For some of those, he does appear to have served jail time, or at the very least a period of time in a young offenders institution, but the story gets back on a more linear track in February 1946 when Peter was 18 years old, going on 19. It was during that month, a few days after Valentine's Day, that Peter first bumped into Detective Constable William Munsey. DC Munsey would become synonymous with the story of Peter Manuel, but the two first met one day when the former was investigating a house that had recently been burgled. It was one of many houses that had been broken into recently. Peter strolled down the street by the house and happily gave the officer his name when asked to disclose it. Such was the bravado of the wannabe American gangster. Whilst frisking Peter, DC Munsey found a gold watch in his pocket, an item that had been reported as stolen from one of the aforementioned houses. Not satisfied by simply robbing the houses, Peter would choose one and use it as his base. The jury is out on whether this is true, but apparently his base of operations wasn't an abandoned house. It was an occupied residence. If that's true, then Peter was also living there whilst being undetected. His burglary skills must have been incredibly well established. Peter was charged with breaking and entering and appeared in court in March 1946 to stand trial for them. The result was a 12-month prison sentence after he pleaded guilty to the charges. Before being sentenced, Peter's £60 bail was paid by his father, Samuel, which allowed him a period of time to commit further atrocities before his prison sentence began. £60 in 1946 equates to roughly $2,700 in 2022, so it was no small sum, especially for Samuel, who was persistently struggling to find work. The key thing to discuss next is that brief period of time when Peter was released on bail. At the time, the Manuel family lived in Mount Vernon, a residential area in Glasgow's East End. The family moved around a lot, as I mentioned earlier. 3 attacks on women in Mount Vernon during March 1946 would all later be attributed to Peter Manuel. The first attack was on a mother walking along a dimly lit footpath with a 3-year-old son. Taking his victim by surprise, Peter jumped out from his hiding place and tackled the unsuspecting woman to the ground as her child watched on in horror. The path appears to have been at the top of a steep bank, with the pair tumbling down it during the scuffle. In a weird chain of events, Peter suddenly stopped attacking the woman and made his way up the bank towards the no doubt crying child. He didn't attack the child, he intended simply to escape the situation. In the middle of doing so, Peter had another sudden brainwave and made his way back down the bank. The woman, still on the floor, was subjected to a series of hard kicks from her attacker before he finally stopped and walked off, this time without returning. Amazingly, the badly beaten woman was able to struggle her way back up the bank towards her child and made her way to the local police station. She explained to them what had happened and even provided them with a detailed description of what her attacker looked like. With Peter Manuel well known to the police, the officers had a good idea about who her attacker was. Peter wasn't brought in by the police then, as he was laying low for a few days. They couldn't find him. Despite laying low, Peter continued his spree. The second of the 3 attacks occurred within 24 hours of the first. The victim again was a young woman, but this time she didn't have a child with her. Peter attacked a nurse who was making her way home after finishing her shift at the local hospital. He was brazen with this attack. As the woman made her way down a footpath, Peter stood in the open ahead of her, a short distance away. The only way she could get past was to walk directly around or through Peter. He was blocking a path. Sensing danger, it's unclear whether the nurse stopped or slowed considerably because Peter decided to run at her rather than wait for her to reach him. Tackling her as he had his victim a day earlier, the two tumbled to the floor, but Peter quickly gained the upper hand. After punching her repeatedly in the head, she let out a scream so loud that it took her attacker by surprise. As a result, Peter ran off for fear that the loud scream would attract somebody's attention. Again, Peter's description was given to the police, further convincing them that he was the one responsible for both attacks. Still unable to be located by the police, Peter attacked the third woman shortly after the second. All 3 attacks took place within a 48-hour period. He was gone for a total of 4 days. The third victim, again a woman, was attacked as she got off a bus a short distance from her home. Peter stalked her along a footpath, something which didn't go unnoticed by the woman. Again choosing to run towards his victim, Peter punched her in the head from behind, knocking her teeth out. He escalated things with this third attack. Peter dragged the woman away from the path and covered her mouth with his hand. If she dared make a sound, he would end her life, he said. Peter took the woman to an isolated area near a train track and proceeded to rape her. After, Peter ran away. The brave woman managed to scramble herself up and make her way to a road where she caught the attention of a passing motorist. She was taken to the police station and provided another solid description of Peter Manuel. A pattern was emerging and the police needed to act fast before further women were attacked. As far as we know, those 3 attacks are the only confirmed ones committed by Peter Manuel. Realistically, it's more than likely he attacked several more women that never came forward. By the time police organised identity parades, known across the pond as police lineups, Peter was already serving his 12-month sentence for breaking and entering. Only one of the 3 female victims managed to correctly identify Peter Manuel as being the man who attacked her. One of the other 2 fainted during the parade, and the other appears to have selected the wrong person. It's worth noting that there were no 2-way mirrors back then for such things as an identity parade. The victims will have had to stand face to face with their attacker and tap him on the shoulder to identify him. I'm not surprised one of the 2 women fainted. What a traumatizing experience that must have been. Peter would go on to be charged with just one of the 3 attacks. It was the rape of the third victim that saw him appearing at Glasgow High Court in June 1946. Peter refused legal counsel, opting instead to represent himself. His legal work needed some improvement as, despite protesting his innocence, Peter was found guilty by the jury and handed an 8-year prison sentence to be served at Peterhead Prison, a specialist centre for sex offenders. The 8-year term was to begin upon completion of his pre-existing 12-month sentence. Realising that behaving like a model prisoner might benefit him in the long run by having his sentence reduced, Peter would regularly help his fellow prisoners with their reading and writing. Writing things was a passion of Peter's. Poems and short stories were of particular interest to him. He told anyone who would listen tall tales of his childhood in Prohibition-era America and how his dad was a mobster named Old Sparky. I wonder if the other prisoners realised that nickname belonged to the electric chair. Maybe he said his dad was a gangster executioner. Sickeningly, Peter Manuel was released from prison in 1952 after only serving a total of 6 years. Pretty shocking, considering he was supposed to serve 9 years, which would have been much longer if he'd been convicted of the first 2 attacks in March 1946. A free man once more, Peter worked various jobs at that time. He wasn't exactly a working man, he wanted to be a gangster. The 9-to-5 lifestyle didn't appeal to him one bit. It didn't take long for his criminal tendencies to take hold, and he soon became an integral part of Glasgow's criminal underworld. Having said that, he spent most of his time liaising with the police as an informant, which gave him a power trip and an ego boost. In 1954, the then 27-year-old Peter met a woman who would not only become the love of his life, but the separation from said woman would start a chain of events that would change the lives of so many forever. Anna O'Hara worked in Glasgow as a bus conductor when she met Peter Manuel. She appeared to have brought out the best in Peter, and he seemingly left his criminal past behind him. Not that Anna knew about that, of course. Her family liked Peter. He was the perfect boyfriend, and by May of 1955 his status was elevated to that of fiancé after he popped the question and the pair became engaged. Poor Anna had no idea that her expensive engagement ring, which she proudly displayed, was a fake. After purchasing a perfectly legitimate, expensive ring and offering it to Anna during the proposal, Peter one day took it back to the store and got a refund without her knowledge. He then purchased a cheap imitation ring and switched it with the one that Anna had in her drawer, and that's the one she ended up wearing. Weddings weren't something that took a year or two of planning back in those days, as they typically are today. The wedding date was set for July 30th, 1955, 2 months after the engagement, but it didn't go ahead. The issue was not Peter's sordid past, rather it was his lack of religious faith. Anna and her family were devout Catholics. Peter came from a Catholic background too, but he was far from involved in the religious practices of the church. Peter refused to be involved with Mass, an unacceptable stance as far as Anna was concerned. Perhaps Peter feared confessing for his sins, for he had plenty. The breakup took its toll on him, and his usual tip-top appearance became dishevelled. He would encourage his fellow criminals to stay away from women, such was his bitterness at being separated from his beloved Anna. When July 30th came round, Peter took his frustration out on a 29-year-old woman named Mary McLaughlin. She was arriving home after attending a local dance. Drunk as a skunk, Peter spotted Mary walk past his house that evening, and he decided to sneak up on her from behind, as he had with the 3 women in March 1946. Covering her mouth to ensure she couldn't scream, Peter led Mary to a secluded area in the middle of a field. He held a knife to her throat the entire time. To gain entry to the field, the pair had to climb over a fence topped with barbed wire. Mary screamed as the barbed wire sliced through parts of her flesh, which led to Peter punching her in the face and demanding that she be quiet. The initial screams from Mary were heard by a man named John Buchanan, a local shopkeeper whose caravan overlooked the field. Concerned at what he had heard, John gathered a group of neighbours and searched the nearby field for the scream's source. A policeman was passing by at the time and joined the search party. Spotting numerous people with torches walking nearby, Peter dragged Mary to the ground and demanded she remain quiet and still. The pair lay there for an hour. The knife didn't move a millimetre from Mary's throat for the duration. Once the search party dissipated, Peter began to force himself upon Mary. He assaulted her before stopping abruptly. That appeared to be another trait he had, stopping as suddenly as he'd started. For another hour, Mary had to lay there listening to Peter divulging all his problems. Hoping to buy some time, Mary played along and actively encouraged Peter to continue talking for as long as possible. He mentioned how depressed he was after splitting up with Anna, and how he'd even considered suicide at one point. The wedding date was the straw that broke the camel's back. It was during that second hour that Mary realised she had recognised her attacker. They sometimes caught the same bus in the morning. As the pair walked back home, Peter began to ask Mary some personal questions about her life. Thinking quickly, she gave false answers to each question. She didn't want him to know a single thing about her or her life. Mary told Peter that she would not report him, but after arriving home and breaking down in front of her family, she decided to report him to the police the following morning. The knife, which Peter had thrown into the ground in the field, was soon found by the police. His fingerprints, of course, were all over it. Mary's blood was also later found on Peter's clothes after she correctly identified her attacker in an identity parade. As you'd expect, Peter denied any involvement, insisting he had spent the evening in question with another woman. That woman was questioned by the police, and it was true she had spent an evening with Peter, but it wasn't the evening Mary was attacked. As he had before, Peter defended himself during the trial, and on that occasion, he was successful. Whilst denying his involvement in the attack, the prosecution pointed out that he had already admitted his guilt. At some point when he was interviewed, he did admit that he was guilty of committing the attack on Mary, but the loophole was that he hadn't admitted it when he was under oath. A clever little trick Peter used was to put across his version of events whilst remaining not under oath. Whilst he was representing himself and putting his version of the case across to the jury, Peter used a clever little trick that was kind of a loophole in the Scottish legal system at the time. It's since been closed. He put across his version of events whilst not technically under oath, so he couldn't be cross-examined by the prosecution. That essentially prevented him from committing perjury and led to the jury favouring his testimony. After feeding the jury some cock and bull story about how he and Mary knew each other and they'd simply had a fallout which involved Peter punching Mary in the face, as you do, the jury returned to the courtroom with a not guilty verdict. Talk about feeding someone's already massive ego. He must have had a god complex at that point and felt like one of the untouchables. A free man once more, Peter Manuel would wait until the new year to commit another of his heinous crimes. This time the result would be murder. Let me introduce a 17-year-old girl named Anne Kneilands from High Blantyre in South Lanarkshire. One of 6 children, she had 3 sisters and 2 brothers. Anne worked as a factory machinist for a tailoring firm based in Glasgow. In the holiday period between Christmas 1955 and New Year 1956, Anne had been to a dance and met a man whom she wanted to go on a date with. That man was Private Andrew Mernin, a soldier on leave for Christmas who was in the British Army's Parachute Regiment. They had arranged to meet at a bus terminus on Monday, January 2nd, 1956. They planned to catch the 6:15 bus into Glasgow. Anne set off at around 5:20 p.m, leaving herself plenty of time to get to the bus terminus. As Anne had feared, Private Mernin was a no-show. She had predicted that would happen to her sister Alice before setting off. Alice recalled how Anne had said if her fears came true, she would return home on the next bus, which in this case was at either 6:40 or 6:44 p.m. With 20 or so minutes to pass, Anne popped in to see her friend, a member of the Simpson family, for a chat. Returning to the bus terminus in time for her bus home, a disappointed Anne took a seat and sat silently as it made its way towards her home. Molly Peacock was the bus driver for that journey, and she recalled Anne getting off the bus at the famous Willow Tea Rooms in East Kilbride. After spending time with the Simpson family, she left at around 6:40 p.m. to catch the bus back home and was seen dismounting the bus shortly after. That would be the last time anyone saw her alive. At first, Anne's parents were not worried that she hadn't returned home on the evening of January 2nd. Knowing her better than anyone, they knew that sometimes she would stay at a friend's house rather than come straight home. She was almost an adult after all. By the time January 4th came around, that all changed. A dog walker named George Gribben found Anne's badly beaten body at East Kilbride Golf Club. George was a keen collector of lost golf balls, that's why he was walking his dog there. The area of the golf course where Anne's body was found appears to be known locally as Capel Rig Copse. Here's what the police believe happened. Anne was walking alone down a nearby road. More than likely it was the nearby Max Welton Road. She was then attacked from behind by someone far more powerful than her, but curiously the police believed he was shorter in stature. Peter Manuel was around 5 feet 4 inches in height, 3 or so inches below the average male height in the UK at the time. Anne was around an inch or 2 taller than Peter, standing at roughly 5 feet 5 inches. Attempting to escape her attacker, Anne headed towards the golf course and lost one of her shoes. It was later found in a ditch. Whether she intended to run towards the golf course or not is not confirmed, but I don't think she would have necessarily had the foresight to make that decision given the circumstances. During her attempted escape, Anne lost her other shoe whilst climbing over a barbed wire topped fence. The The barbs caused a series of cuts on her arms and legs. An already bloodied Anne ran with no shoes onto the golf course before her attacker finally caught up with her. Anne was and beaten with a blunt instrument, later identified as a length of iron, leaving her skull decimated. The body appeared to have been moved from the kill site to where it was found. It's unclear whether her attacker did that immediately or returned to do so later. Anne's possessions had been spread out over around 300 square yards. Her family were then told that a body had been found and was believed to be Anne's. When Anne's family was questioned, Alice mentioned that Anne had left the house 2 days earlier to meet Private Andrew Mernin. Alice had been at the dance with Anne when they met, so was able to provide a solid description of him. Private Mernin had a solid alibi, however. On the night of the murder, he was with his friends and family. They confirmed that was the case when they were later questioned. The media dubbed Anne's murder the 5th tee murder. One assumes her body was found near the golf course's 5th tee. At a loss and with no leads to follow, the police were soon informed that Elizabeth Simpson, a 13-year-old girl whose family Anne had visited on January 2nd before catching her next bus, had made an important discovery. She found a handbag at the rear of the property that was later identified as belonging to Anne. This potentially tells us something rather dark about her arrogant killer. To me, this confirms that her killer, spoiler alert, it was Peter Manuel, had been watching her ever since she arrived at Capelrig bus terminus. He must have followed her to the Simpsons' house and made a mental note of the location. How else do you explain why he dumped Anne's handbag at the only other place she visited that evening? Talk about sick and twisted mind games. That was Peter Manuel all over. He thrived off playing with people's emotions and getting into people's heads. His egotistical personality made him believe he could do whatever he wanted without being caught. He was prepared to push the boundaries close to the edge without fear of repercussions. The other theory, of course, is that he wanted to frame the Simpson family as having been involved with the murder. As far as I can tell, that was never considered a viable explanation, and they weren't ever considered suspects. At that point in time, Peter Manuel was working for the gas board, and some of the projects he worked on were based around the golf course. He returned to work after the murder with scratches all over his face, indicating that Anne did her best to put up a fight against him. Peter was questioned along with other workmen as to what they saw on the day of the murder, to which Peter replied by saying he had seen a beardless man acting strangely in the area. The only strange thing about that comment is describing someone as beardless. Who does that? It was a nonsense story anyway, as most stories usually were when they left Peter's mouth. Knowing what they knew already about Peter and his criminal exploits, the police turned up at his parents' house unannounced a week or so after the murder. As they would go on to do regularly, they covered for their son by saying he had been with them all night at home on January 2nd. Dear listener, I'd love to know what you would do in their situation. As a parent, would you outright lie and cover for your child by saying they were with you on the night of the murder if they weren't? Please get in touch and let me know your thoughts on that one. With no evidence to work with, the police had no option but to stop treating Peter as a suspect. Do you think getting away with murder once stopped Peter from killing again? If you do, this might be the first ever true crime story you've heard. He didn't kill again for a few months. A cooling off period is synonymous with serial killers. It's one of the things that defines them as such. Peter Manuel wouldn't kill again until September 1956, 8 months after killing Anne Kneilands. Before we get to their murders, let me introduce the Watt family. William Watt, the patriarch, was a former police reservist with a bakery business and husband to 45-year-old Marion Watt. Their daughter, 16-year-old Vivian, lived with them at 5 Fensbank Avenue in Burnside, South Lanarkshire. They had moved there in the summer of 1956 to make a better life for themselves. By September 1956, Marion was recovering from an operation on her heart, which left her ever reliant on her teenage daughter. To repay her, Marion decided to take Vivian on a short getaway vacation, leaving William at home. To make sure he had his opportunity to relax, Marion said that upon their return, he could have a short getaway of his own. Abso-bloody-lutely, he said. When the mother and sister pair returned, keen fisherman William packed up his gear and headed for the Cairnban Hotel, located just off the banks of the Crinan Canal in Cairnban. William made the trip on September 9th, 1956, and on September 16th, a week later, he had his car's engine briefly checked by a local mechanic. He booked a more thorough check for the following day, September 17th. On the evening of September 16th, William phoned Marion at home. It was around 10:30 p.m. when he called. Marion said that she and Vivian were fine, and she no doubt asked him if he was enjoying his well-deserved fishing break. Once the pleasantries were out of the way, Marion explained that 41-year-old Margaret Brown, her sister and William's sister-in-law, had popped over and would be spending the night there. Vivian had also invited her friend Dina Valente around, though she planned to return home at some point rather than spend the night. The two teenagers spent the evening listening to music on the record player, whilst the adults chatted and put the world to rights. When Dina eventually left to make her way home, she didn't know that she would be the last person to see the other three women alive. Peter Manuel broke into the Watt family's home via the front door in the early hours of September 17, 1956. He smashed the glass window panel and opened it by reaching through and turning the lock. Armed with a British Webley .38 caliber service revolver, Peter had far more than just robbery on his mind. The gun was legally owned and registered to him, by the way. I did say he was a rather arrogant fellow, using his own gun. As he made his way around the house, the first occupied room he found was where Marion and Margaret were sleeping. The sisters were sharing the same bed. His first victim was Marion Watt, whom he shot in the head at point-blank range, killing her instantly. Naturally, the noise of the gun going off woke up Margaret. As she attempted to clamber out of bed, she was immediately shot and killed by Peter, who fired the gun twice to kill Margaret. The police would state that both women's clothes had been interfered with, but that's the only information I have in that regard. With the two adults now dead, that left young Vivian all alone in the house with Peter Manuel. Peter punched Vivian in the face, incapacitating her before tying her hands behind her back and assaulting her. Once his urges had been satiated, Peter shot and killed 16-year-old Vivian Watt just as he had her mum and aunt. He then covered each woman's body with bed sheets before leaving and heading home. On September 15, 1956, a break-in at a house over the road from the Watt family added further detail to this already convoluted story. Peter Manuel broke into the house of Margaret and Mary Martin, a pair of retired sisters who had left earlier that day to go on holiday. He used the empty house as his base and treated it with zero respect. He trashed the entire place but stole nothing. The same method used to break into the Watt home was used when entering the Martin home. He smashed the front door's glass panel before letting himself in. When I say he stole nothing, that's not entirely true. He stole a pair of one of the sisters' nylon tights and used them as makeshift gloves when breaking into the Watt house. On the day of the Watt family murders, Marion was due to receive a wake-up call at 7 a.m. from the phone company. On the day of the Watt family murders, Marion Watt was due to receive a wake-up call at 7 a.m. from the phone company. Nobody answered despite them calling 3 times. A couple of hours later, the family cleaner arrived, but nobody responded when she knocked on the door. That was most peculiar. It's not clear how, I assume she had a key, but the cleaner eventually entered the house and discovered the massacre inside. She reportedly ran outside and spotted the postman doing his morning rounds. She ran over to him and shouted, "There's been a murder." The police were then called and the entire house was sealed off once they arrived. Whilst conducting house-to-house inquiries, the police discovered that the Martin home had been burglarised in such a way that they believed they knew who was responsible. The murders were being treated as a different crime altogether, but Peter Manuel was soon taken in and charged with breaking and entering. The next part of the timeline is also a little bit hazy. Still, from what I could gather, I understand that Peter was found guilty of breaking and entering and sentenced to serve another 12-month jail sentence in Barlinnie Prison, Scotland's largest. With his jail sentence starting in October 1956 and ending in November 1957, Peter spent 13 months in jail on that occasion. But what about the murders of the Watt family? The key suspect, believe it or not, was the family patriarch, William. After calling home on the evening of September 16, 1956, William went to the hotel bar and had a few drinks with the hotel's owner, Mr. Leitch. Retiring to bed a half hour after midnight, William had plans of an early start the following day. Bearing in mind he had his car booked in for another check, he likely wanted to get up extra early to do some fishing. That's what he was there for, after all. William Watt had borrowed an alarm clock from Mr. Leitch so that he could set it for 6 a.m. and be on his way to catch some fishies. What he'd done was set the alarm for 6 p.m. rather than 6 a.m, so it never went off. He would later explain that he disabled the alarm when actually he'd just set it wrong. That accidental lie didn't do him any favours with the police. William was next seen by one of the hotel's waitresses shortly after 8 a.m. on September 17, 1956. He told the waitress that he had awoken naturally at 7 a.m. putting him an hour behind schedule, but he had still driven to the local fishing spot to scout it out with plans to return later in the day. He'd gone back to the hotel for his breakfast. Here's where it gets interesting and starts to go wrong for William Watt. An overly keen journalist thought it would be a wise decision to call the work of Margaret Brown's husband on the morning her body had been discovered at the Watt home. It's worth noting that Mr. Brown had not yet been notified of his wife's demise. The journalist didn't outright say why he was calling. For legal reasons, one assumes he wasn't able to. Not that what he was doing was legal or ethical anyway, but he likely wanted an early scoop for an upcoming article on the murders. The harassment continued until Mr. Brown had had enough and called the police to make a complaint. It was at that point he was notified of his wife's murder. Back at the Cairnban Hotel, a call came through from an individual claiming to be Mr. Watt's business associate. It's thought that it was likely the same journalist harassing Mr. Brown, but that's unsubstantiated. Note that he said Mr. Watt rather than William Watt. That raised a red flag for the hotel's owner upon answering the phone. When pressed to confirm Mr. Watt's first name, the caller explained that he had forgotten, at which point Mr. Leitch hung up. Another call came a few minutes later. This time it was someone who legitimately knew William Watt, his brother, John. John informed Mr. Leitch that William's wife, daughter and sister-in-law had been murdered in their home in the early hours. William was sent for by way of a taxi organised by Mr. Leitch, and the news was soon broken to him. Making his way home in cars driven by a generous local and a policeman, William did his best to put on a brave face, which included him solemnly smiling whilst talking to the police officer. The officer took that as confirmation that William was likely the one responsible for killing his family. Now, the distance from the hotel to the house is roughly 94 miles. To get from the house to the hotel, you have to drive northwest through the middle of Glasgow, across the River Clyde, drive up the full length of Loch Lomond's west side, around the top end of Loch Long, up past the west side of Benim, across then down to Castleton before coming back up towards Loch Gilphead and arriving finally in Cairnban. My point is it's a hell of a drive, albeit a ridiculously picturesque one. Still, the police thought that William had done that drive, killed his family in the middle of the night, and then driven back to the hotel before finally being seen by the waitress, who assumed he'd been there all night. Hell of a plan, but there's a fair few flaws in this, apart from the ridiculousness of it. To make it even less believable than it already is, the Erskine Bridge, which crosses the River Clyde from Erskine to Old Kilpatrick, was opened by Princess Anne on July 2nd, 1971, almost 15 years after William allegedly made that drive. In 1956, the only way to get across the River Clyde was by boarding the Erskine Ferry. The police didn't care. They were convinced he could have made that journey between 12:30 a.m. and 8 a.m. A 4-hour round trip, add a little bit of time for the murders. Plenty of time, that's what they thought. It was William's alleged history of being unfaithful to his wife that led them to believe he had motive to warrant such a long and ridiculous journey. The theory began to fall apart when the alarm clock issue came to light. It went off at 6 p.m. that night. Remember, he'd set it for 6 a.m. or so he'd thought. That just added to his testimony that he'd said it wrong, or as he said, disabled it. It was also revealed that a witness had seen him wiping the frost off his windshield that morning. There wouldn't have been any frost if his engine had been on all night. William's beloved fishing spot, the Crinan Canal, was searched as the police continued with the theory of him being the number one suspect. To everyone's surprise but William, they found absolutely nothing. Amazingly, the triple bereaved William Watt spent 67 days in Barlinnie prison despite being completely innocent. It's frightening to think that the real killer, Peter Manuel, was serving his own sentence in Barlinnie for breaking and entering. He could have been in a cell a few doors down from William. William Watt was represented by a lawyer named Lawrence Dowdall, and before long Peter Manuel reached out to him and asked him to represent his conviction's appeal. Was this further mind games by Peter? Did he know who William's lawyer was? It's a remarkable coincidence if not. When Peter was released in November 1957, Lawrence Dowdall suggested that the pair meet for lunch with William Watt to clear the air. Imagine being a fly on the wall at that meeting. Peter knew he'd killed William's entire family, and William strongly suspected Peter to have done so. Meanwhile, in the middle of it all, Lawrence Dowdall likely knew both sides of the story too. The meeting was on December 3rd, 1957, 3 days after Peter's release from Barlinnie prison, and the two rivals supposedly cleared the air. Peter told a tale of how he'd met a man who'd asked him to break into the Martin house. A day later he saw the man again and noted how much of a state he appeared to be in. He was implying that he'd killed the Watt family by that point. Peter said the man asked him to dispose of a revolver, so he threw it in the River Clyde. He was mixing the truth with fiction there. He casually admitted to throwing away the murder weapon in the river, but also shifted the blame for the actual murders onto a third party. With the full support of the police, Lawrence Dowdall continued to meet with Peter and encouraged him to continue telling the tales of his exploits. He slipped up at one point when he said that Margaret Brown had been shot twice, so his supposed friend had told him. Not even the press knew that information. Only the police knew, so either Peter's story of a mysterious assassin was true, or he'd committed the murders himself. Furthermore, Peter described the Watt house in explicit detail, all the while claiming it was coming from what the mystery man had told him. He even explained how each of the victims had been murdered. No detail was spared. Lawrence Dowdall eventually stopped indulging Peter, which annoyed him greatly to the point where he reached out to the lawyer with a detailed sketch of the murder weapon. He was making a rod for his own back. William Watt also continued to meet Peter in an attempt to gather evidence against him. William was told the man responsible for murdering his family was Charles Tallis. He explained away the murders as a simple yet tragic misunderstanding. Perhaps bored with mentally torturing William Watt and wasting the time of Lawrence Dowdall, Peter returned to his murderous ways on December 8, 1957. 36-year-old Sidney Dunn was a taxi driver and former soldier from Newcastle. He had served in the Royal Air Force. Sidney typically met with a woman in Gateshead on Saturdays, but that weekend their plans had clashed and they opted to meet on the Sunday instead. Sidney was last seen alive in his car in the early hours of that Sunday by a fellow taxi driver. He was with a customer who wanted to be driven to the village of Edmund Byers in County Durham. At around 8 a.m. that morning, one witness recalled seeing an abandoned car on the side of the road. Both of the front doors were open, and all of the lights had been smashed. Nobody thought it was something that needed investigating further. The situation was only looked at when a policeman happened to be cycling past and took a peek inside. Once he'd made his way to the nearest police station, the officer checked to see if there were any reports of a motor vehicle accident or if anyone had been admitted to hospital recently after a car crash. Nothing for either. When a team of officers began searching the area surrounding the car, it didn't take long for the dogs to sniff out the corpse of Sidney Dunn. He had been shot in the head at point-blank range and dragged away from the road to a more secluded area before being left there. It didn't appear to be a robbery gone wrong, as all of his personal possessions were found scattered around the area between the car and his body. With nothing to go on, the police initially thought this may have been a run-of-the-mill car accident. That soon changed once the post-mortem confirmed the cause of death as being a gunshot wound to the head. A .38 caliber weapon was suspected of being responsible, the same caliber gun that was used to kill the Watt family. Appeals were launched for the passenger Sidney picked up in the early hours to come forward, as the police believed the taxi driver's killer had been sitting in the passenger seat when he pulled the trigger. Nobody came forward. Another dead end. Peter Manuel would not be convicted of that murder until after his own death. It was a coroner's jury that eventually found him guilty of Sidney Dunn's murder. Fast forward 2 and a bit weeks later to December 25th, 1957, Christmas Day. There's no ideal time to get burgled, but Christmas Day takes the biscuit. Reverend Alexander Houston and his wife returned home after presumably spending the morning in church conducting the Christmas morning service. Their house had been robbed by a burglar who had broken both the front and back doors. Amongst the items stolen were a pair of sheepskin gloves, a camera, a few quid from the collection box belonging to the church, and, bizarrely, a sock. The gloves were the item that upset the Reverend the most, as they were given to him as a gift from a neighbouring family whom he saw as dear friends. Another family living on the same street as the glove givers was Mr. and Mrs. Coooke and their 4 children, who lived at 5 Carrick Drive in Mount Vernon. Mount Vernon, you'll recall, is where Peter Manuel attacked 3 women in March 1946. The Coooke house was located only a few hundred yards from the footpath where the first victim was attacked. That was the woman with a 3-year-old son. The eldest of the Coooke children, and the only girl, was 17-year-old Isabelle Coooke. Isabelle was a 6th form pupil at Hamilton Academy. On December 28, 1957, 3 days after the gloves were stolen from Reverend Houston's house, Isabelle was left home alone to babysit her 3 younger brothers. Mr. and Mrs. Coooke left home around 4 p.m. that afternoon. For what reason, I'm not sure. Isabelle had plans to go to a dance at Uddingston Grammar School with her boyfriend Douglas Bryden that evening, so she held high hopes that her parents would be home in time. As it turned out, Mr. and Mrs. Coooke didn't return home until 8 p.m, by which point Isabelle had left her 3 brothers at home with their grandma and set off to catch a bus. The grandma told Mr. and Mrs. Coooke that Isabelle had left the house at 6:45 p.m, intent on catching the 7:30 p.m. bus. It would come to light much later that Isabelle's father believed she must have taken a shortcut to ensure she caught her bus in time. That shortcut would have taken Isabelle along the same footpath I mentioned earlier, where Peter Manuel attacked the first woman in March 1946. The plan was for Isabelle to meet up with Douglas and they would then travel to the dance together. That plan changed when Isabelle didn't show up. Thinking she may have changed the plan without informing him, Douglas made his own way to the dance after waiting almost an hour for Isabelle to show up. Isabelle wasn't at the dance either. Perhaps she didn't fancy it, Douglas likely thought. How coincidental is this? Mr. and Mrs. Cook's phone line was not working properly that evening, which they only discovered later that night. Initially worried about their daughter not returning home or calling them if she decided to stay with a friend, the Cooks relaxed a little and assumed that Isabelle had probably tried to call but couldn't get through. They were wrong. At around midnight, Mr. Coooke went out with a torch to search for Isabelle, but he found nothing. That left him with no choice but to call the police the following morning and report Isabelle as missing. That afternoon, reports came back that some of Isabelle's personal belongings had been found by the river and train tracks. Isabelle's killer was playing games with the police. Peter Manuel had scattered her belongings in pretty much a straight line from her house to his. Despite finding her clothes and belongings, Isabelle's body was not found at that point. It would be almost 3 weeks later, on January 16, 1958, that her parents were delivered the devastating news that their eldest child's body had been found. We've got a lot more to cover before we get to that part of the story though. Let's Craig David back to December 31st, 1957, 3 days after Isabelle Coooke went missing, New Year's Eve. The next unfortunate targets of Peter Manuel were the Smart family. Married couple Peter and Doris Smart lived in Uddingston, a short distance away from where Peter Manuel was holding up at the time. Peter Smart was 45, Doris was 42, and Michael was 10. On New Year's Eve 1957, Peter Smart finished work and paid a visit to the Commercial Bank of Scotland. Once there, he asked the teller if he could withdraw £35 from his account, just short of £800 in 2022, and once received, he appears to have made his way home. The cash was to clear some outstanding debts. He'd just been paid, as far as I can tell. He returned home with £25 in cash after using 10 of it to clear some debts. The key point about that cash withdrawal is that the notes were brand new, fresh out of the packet. That's something you need to remember. I'll get to why shortly. After celebrating the new year at home, the Smart family planned to take some time off to visit friends and family across Scotland. They planned to return home on January 6, 1958. Sadly, that plan was stopped on New Year's Eve. After picking up some whiskey bottles from the local pub, Peter Smart left for home around 10 p.m. Seeing in the new year in typical British fashion, the Smarts called it a night at roughly 2:30 a.m. in the early hours of New Year's Day. That's when neighbours recall witnessing the lights in their house being turned off. When the Smarts didn't turn up as planned at their relatives' houses, each relative assumed they were with other relatives instead. That vital series of miscommunications meant no alarm bells were raised until January 6th, when Peter Smart failed to turn up for work. Peter Manuel's New Year's Eve consisted of spending the evening with his family at the pub. Short on money as he always seemed to be, Peter happily pocketed change meant for his dad after Samuel had bought the family a round of drinks. That sly theft was witnessed by Joe Brannan, another Glasgow-based criminal. Joe took that to mean that Peter was struggling with his finances. Back at the house, Peter ensured he was the last one awake. A pull-out bed had been set up for him downstairs, as it was every night, so once his brother James had followed their parents to bed a short while after them, Peter seized his chance. He had an hour before his dad was due to get up for work, plenty of time to do what he needed. After making his way to the Smart house, a 15-minute walk away, Peter Manuel shot and killed Peter Smart, Doris Smart and Michael Smart as they slept. Peter Smart was shot and killed first, with Doris a close second. That makes sense, as they will have been in the same bed, just like Marion Watt and Margaret Brown were. He killed Michael last and later claimed that he believed the youngster was an adult. Once finished, Peter pocketed the cash withdrawn from the Commercial Bank of Scotland, took Peter Smart's car keys, and made his way home. Reports suggest he even ate a couple of biscuits before leaving. Peter Manuel was reportedly fast asleep on the pull-out bed when his dad got up for work. Whether that's true or not, we'll never know, because Samuel made a habit of lying for his son to cover his tracks and provide him with alibis. Remember John Buchanan, the shopkeeper who led the search of the field next to his caravan after hearing the scream of Mary McLaughlin on July 30th, 1955. He opened his shop on New Year's Day 1958 and remembered that Peter Manuel was his first customer at around 10 a.m. He bought a pack of cigarettes and appeared to be in a buoyant mood. Once his purchase was complete, Peter went to the pub to meet Joe Brannan. Despite appearing to be strapped for cash the previous evening, Peter Manuel was now splashing the cash and on more than one occasion bought everyone a round of drinks. Joe made a mental note of that. On January 2nd, 1958, a police officer was heading towards the River Calder. He was to form part of a search party tasked with finding Isabelle Coooke. He was suddenly offered a lift by a passing motorist and, happy to get out of the cold, the officer accepted. That motorist was Peter Manuel, driving Peter Smart's car. Next level arrogance right there. He was rubbing his crimes in the police's face without them realising. Peter dropped the officer at the crime scene, said goodbye, and casually drove off. Over the next few days, neighbours of the Smart family noticed the curtains were sometimes drawn and sometimes closed, indicating that someone was inside the house. As far as they knew, it was Peter Smart, Doris, or Michael. Perhaps their trip had been cut short for some reason. The neighbours had no clue it was Peter Manuel making frequent visits to the property whilst the bodies lay in the same spot he'd left them on January 1st. As I alluded to earlier, Peter Smart failed to turn up for work on January 6, 1958, highly out of character. Later that day, his workplace received a phone call from the police. They wanted to know why a company car, registered to Peter Smart, was seemingly abandoned in one of the rougher areas of Glasgow. Concerns grew as nobody could get in touch with Peter Smart, and eventually the police broke into his house under the power of a search warrant. The bodies of Peter, Doris and Michael were soon found, and the local papers had a new headline. Isabelle Cook's disappearance had all but gone to the back of everyone's minds. The possibility of both cases being connected was never considered at that point. In a move considered out of character for the criminal underworld, Joe Brannan and several others had decided that they were sick and tired of Peter Manuel's boasts about the horrific crimes he had committed. They didn't take kindly to the murder of women and children, so the decision was made to break their own code of ethics. Omerta didn't apply when it involved Peter Manuel. Joe Brannan went to the police and explained how he had some information they may be interested in. Peter's newfound wealth was the key thing of note, especially since there was evidence of Peter Smart withdrawing the cash from the bank, which was no longer at his house. I told you to remember the notes were brand new. Here's why. They had easily traceable serial numbers on them, which helped the police connect the cash in the till at the pub Peter visited on New Year's Day to the cash withdrawn by Peter Smart on New Year's Eve. Still, that evidence was only circumstantial. It didn't tie Peter Manuel to the crimes. A task force was compiled by the police, and their job was to track Peter Manuel's movements 24/7. They wanted to make sure he didn't kill again before they had gathered enough evidence to secure a conviction. For a full week, the officers monitored him whilst officers in the background collated their evidence. Finally, a search warrant was secured, and a team of officers visited Peter Manuel at his parents' home. It was either January 13th or 14th, 1958. I believe it was the latter. Arriving shortly before 7 a.m. that morning, the police officers showed the warrant and explained why they were there. Samuel kicked off big time, as you'd expect, and once Peter had been summoned, he was uncharacteristically angry in the presence of the police. He demanded to see the warrant, and once he'd settled down, a couple of officers escorted him to the local police station. The other officers searched the property, and it wasn't much of a surprise when they found the missing gloves and camera that Reverend Houston had reported as being stolen from his house on Christmas Day 1957. Samuel insisted they were given to Peter as a Christmas present, but they knew he was lying. As a result, Samuel was also taken into custody, a shrewd move by the police that they hoped would lead them to gain a confession from Peter. Their plan worked flawlessly. Peter Manuel admitted to each of the murders he had committed once he was made aware that his father was also being held. To prevent the pair from corroborating their stories, they were held in cells in different police stations. Several identity parades were organised, with witnesses selecting Peter Manuel as the one they recalled spending the cash in the pub on New Year's Day. In an attempt to shift the blame again, Peter told the police whilst being interviewed that a criminal named Samuel McKay, known in the Glasgow underworld as Dandy, was the true murderer. The daft thing about that lie was that Samuel McKay was a real person, so the police simply questioned him and were satisfied that he wasn't responsible for the crimes Peter had said he was. The police made Peter uncomfortable by deliberately not telling him anything about where his father was or what was happening to him. However, they did say he was being held in Barlinnie prison. They knew how much Peter had hated his time there. On January 15th, 1958, Peter wrote a couple of letters in which he offered to willingly give information regarding the murders of Anne Kneilands, the Watt family, Isabelle Coooke and the Smart family, if he was granted the chance to see both his parents. He even told the officers how he'd picked up that one officer on January 2nd who was on his way to the crime scene whilst driving Peter Smart's car. That officer would then correctly identify Peter Manuel from an identity parade. With a full confession inbound, the police allowed Peter to see his parents, but the meeting didn't go as he'd hoped. His parents sat silent as Peter struggled to admit what he'd done. After a brief and awkward exchange, the meeting ended, Samuel and Peter were led away, and Bridget went home. Samuel was released from prison a short while after that final meeting. It was only then, on January 16, 1958, that Isabelle Cook's body was finally found, 19 days after she went missing. Peter Manuel led the police to the spot where he'd buried Isabelle in a shallow grave on the grounds of Burnt Broom Farm. Reverend Houston was tasked with breaking the news about the grim discovery to Isabelle Cook's family. Peter Manuel's trial would be dubbed the trial of the century by the media. As always, Peter decided to represent himself. He was cocksure right to the end. It was a bold move considering the death sentence was still a thing back then. It was on its way out, but still relevant. The trial, which took place at Glasgow High Court, was overseen by Judge Lord Cameron. It was his first ever criminal case, believe it or not. What a way to introduce yourself. The 8 charges against Peter Manuel were the murders of Anne Kneilands, Marion Watt, Vivian Watt, Margaret Brown, Isabelle Coooke, Doris Smart, Peter Smart and Michael Smart. Sidney Dunn's murder was not discussed as it took place in a different legal jurisdiction. Pleading not guilty to each charge, Peter played the blame game again. In a twist worthy of being in any primetime TV court drama, Peter Manuel called William Watt to the stand as a witness. The sheer audacity of the man. He planned to make the jury think William had killed his family, but the plan backfired when William was wheeled into the courtroom on a stretcher to testify. William had been in a car crash a few days earlier, leaving him severely injured. It wasn't a good look to try and pin 3 brutal murders on a man in such a state. A similar tactic was used regarding the murder of the Smart family. Peter Manuel conveyed the story that Peter Smart had killed his wife and son before taking his own life in a double murder-suicide situation. This time, the jury was having none of it. They returned to the courtroom after retiring with guilty verdicts for 7 of the 8 charges. The only murder they didn't find Peter Manuel guilty of was that of Anne Kneilands, as they felt the evidence against him didn't make him guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Judge Lord Cameron sentenced Peter Manuel to death by hanging to take place on July 11, 1958. A poem was written by Peter during the trial in which he confessed to the 7 murders he was convicted of. I won't read the whole thing, but here's the last 4 lines. And when they write my epitaph, these words they shall be seen. Here lies Peter Anthony Manuel, Scotland's Frankenstein. Question, do you say Frankenstein or Frankenstein? I've always said Frankenstein, but perhaps that's wrong. On the morning of July 11th, 1958, his execution date, Peter Manuel was awoken at 6 a.m. and given his final meal. With it, he drank a glass of whiskey. His last words were said to be, "Turn it up and I'll go quietly." After being led the short distance to the gallows at 8 a.m, a white hood was placed over his head before the lever was pulled by Harry Allen, one of Britain's last official executioners. Peter Manuel was the 3rd last person to be hanged in Scotland on the back of a criminal trial. Peter Manuel is not only classed as Scotland's first serial killer, but is also seen as Scotland's worst serial killer. We've discussed 9 murders in this episode, 7 of which he was found guilty of committing. Realistically, Peter Manuel's kill count was much higher. Many believe that the true count of his murder rampage could have been as high as 19. And that completes the story of British murderer Peter Manuel. Thanks again, Victoria Craig and Kath McCartney, for suggesting that case. Let me know your thoughts about it in the YouTube comments or on social media. That's it for the Season 6 special. I appreciate it if you've made it this far. It's a mammoth of a case. For now, though, I've been Stuart Blues. This has been British Murders. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time, cheerio.